It was a typical Wednesday afternoon in New York City, and Barron Trump, now a young adult, was quietly navigating life away from the spotlight. While his family continued to draw media attention, Barron preferred a low-key existence. On this particular day, he had just finished a meeting with one of his advisors and decided to stop by a local cafe to read a book and take a break. The cafe was small but charming, the kind of place where the barista knew your name and the regulars exchanged stories. Unbeknownst to Barron, his life was about to intersect with someone in need. Inside the cafe, a middle-aged woman sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Her name was Mrs. Emma Rodriguez, a high school English teacher who had been struggling with a series of medical bills after a sudden illness had kept her out of work for months. While she had managed to scrape by, the mounting debt was beginning to feel unbearable. Her small savings were dwindling, and the weight of the situation was starting to affect her health and spirit. As Barron walked to the counter to order, he couldn't help but notice the woman's weary expression. There was something in her eyes, a quiet sadness, that tugged at him. He ordered his coffee, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. Something about her presence felt familiar, like someone who had dedicated their life to others, but was now facing a struggle of their own. Barron didn't make it a habit of getting involved in the troubles of strangers, but on that day, something felt different. He took a seat at a nearby table, keeping a respectful distance, but continuing to observe. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up to leave, her eyes scanning the cafe before she walked to the counter to pay. Barron noticed that she hesitated when the cashier handed her the bill, as if calculating whether or not she had enough. Without thinking, Barron stood up and walked over to the counter. "I'll cover her bill," he said quietly to the cashier, slipping a credit card across the counter before the cashier could react. It was a simple gesture, but it was one that Barron felt deep down in his heart was the right thing to do. As he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made the right choice. He didn't know why it felt so important, but he felt compelled to act. Later that day, Barron's decision led him to take an even more unexpected step. As he sat at his desk, reflecting on the moment, he thought about how often people like Mrs. Rodriguez, teachers, nurses, and those who give so much to others, sometimes find themselves forgotten in moments of need. In the privacy of his home, Barron made a decision. He would go beyond paying for her coffee and pay off her medical bills in full. He didn't want any recognition, no fanfare, just the knowledge that someone, somewhere, had made her burden a little lighter. Using a private foundation, Barron set up a donation to cover Mrs. Rodriguez's medical costs, ensuring that the payment would be anonymous. He also arranged for a message to be sent to her, simply saying, "A kind gesture from someone who appreciates your work." Nothing more, nothing less. Weeks passed, and Mrs. Rodriguez continued to struggle with the weight of her bills, unaware that her life had just changed. One morning, a letter arrived at her apartment, a certified envelope with no return address. Inside, she found a check covering all her outstanding medical expenses. She read the accompanying note, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized the depth of the gift. Who would do this for me? She wondered aloud, tears welling up in her eyes. The mystery remained, but the relief she felt was overwhelming. It wasn't just the financial freedom that moved her. It was the compassion, the kindness from an anonymous source who saw her struggle and chose to help. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Rodriguez's life began to shift. She returned to work with a renewed sense of purpose, her health improving as the stress of her medical debts melted away. But the impact didn't end there. The act of kindness inspired her to pay it forward. She started a charity drive at her school to help other teachers who faced similar financial challenges, and soon the whole school rallied behind her cause. The message of generosity and compassion spread, touching lives in ways Mrs. Rodriguez could never have imagined. Meanwhile, Barron, though quietly pleased with his decision, continued his life without drawing attention. But he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as he heard about the ripple effect of his small act of kindness. Word eventually got out, though it remained unclear who was behind the gesture. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon the tale of Barron Trump's anonymous donation became a symbol of kindness, reminding everyone that sometimes the most meaningful actions come without recognition. Months later, Barron and Mrs. Rodriguez's paths crossed once more, albeit in an unexpected way. Barron had been invited to give a speech at a local event, and as he looked out into the crowd, he spotted Mrs. Rodriguez among the attendees. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared knowledge of the kindness that had brought them together. After the event, Mrs. Rodriguez approached him, her voice filled with gratitude. "You don't know how much your gesture meant to me," she said. Barron smiled, his response gentle yet sincere. "I'm just glad I could help," he said, keeping his usual modest demeanor. But inside, he knew that the true beauty of the act wasn't in the recognition. It was in the quiet, profound way it had touched her life. The story of Barron Trump's secret gesture remained one of those small, quiet moments of grace that remind us that kindness can have a lasting impact, even when we least expect it. It serves as a reminder that sometimes helping others doesn't need to be loud or public. It just needs to be done with a pure heart. And that's something the world could always use more of.